Yes, a very warm and actually sunny welcome from Germany to all participants to this webinar, Read Your Way Out, How Prison Libraries Promote the Right to Education in the Philippines. My name is Lisa Krolak. I'm the Chief Librarian at the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning in Hamburg, Germany. At UIL, we advocate for education to be a fundamental human right for all that must not be denied to prisoners and all those that are incarcerated. We believe that the transformative potential of education in prison and jail settings is worth to be documented and shared so we can demonstrate the positive impact it has on personal growth, on well-being, on rehabilitation, and providing prisoners with the tools they need to rebuild their lives and to successfully reintegrate once released. The success of these programs does not only directly benefit the inmates, but also contribute to the overall well-being and safety of the communities to which they return. To this effect, we promote effective prison education policies and practices. And as a librarian by profession, my specific research interest in this area is prison libraries. I will moderate this webinar together with Jane Garner from Australia, who will introduce herself in a moment. And for this webinar, we are very fortunate that Mr. Rafael Barreto Souso from UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, will present his experiences with implementing the Read Your Way Out project in the Philippines. This webinar is part of UIL's global webinar series, Unlocking the Power of Lifelong Learning, bringing together stakeholders from across the globe on the first and third Wednesday of every month. It is the first of 4 webinars focusing on prison education. And during this prison education webinars, we will have a closer look at innovative practices that are part of our case study collection on prison education that was launched last October. Currently, this prison education collection is listing 16 cases, but it's growing. So please contact us if you have innovative cases. And I will send the link to the collection in the notes in a moment. Today, we focus in depth on one of these cases, as I mentioned, the one from the Philippines. We have about 1 hour, and you can write your comments, questions into the Q&A box. We will try to answer as many as possible after the presentation. The webinar will be recorded and will be made available to you afterwards. With these words, I'm happy to hand over to Jane Garner to introduce herself. Jane, please.
Thank you, Lisa. So my name is Associate Professor Jane Garner. I belong to a university called Charles Sturt University in Australia, and my role there is as an academic teaching and researching into library and information studies. And most of my work has been looking at the role of libraries in vulnerable communities, and in particular people who are living in incarceration, which is how I came across Rafael and Lisa and the work that we've been doing that Rafael will be talking about, I think, today, getting some libraries into some of the jails in the Philippines. So I'm going to introduce Rafael now, and then he will deliver his presentation. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A option down there. If you have any questions for Rafael, please put them in there and we'll come to them at the end of his presentation. So Rafael Barreto Sousa is a Brazilian attorney and crime prevention and criminal justice officer with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. He's based in Manila and he is focusing on prison reform. He's worked across Latin America, the United States, Sudan, Ukraine, and Southeast Asia. Previously, he supported criminal justice reform with UNDP Brazil and served as a federal monitor of places of detention. He has also held roles at the International Bar Association and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. He has taught law at several Brazilian universities. Rafael holds 2 master's degrees on Development Studies from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and another in Constitutional Law from the Federal University of Ceará in Brazil. I hope I've said that. Ceará, did I get close?
Yeah.
Yeah, good enough. Yeah. All right, so we'll hand over to Raphael. He's going to share his screen and we'll get started with his presentation. Thank you, Raphael.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank for the invitation to speak on this project. It is always a pleasure to collaborate with UNESCO, with Lisa and Jane in particular, in discussing this issue, which is so important for prison reform, for reintegration prospects. And in the Philippine case, the connection of that with a very important and systemic problem, which is prison overcrowding and prison overuse, and how reading can play a role in this scenario. I have a presentation that I will share now my screen, and 1 second, and get it full screen. Can I get a nod from, yeah, is it working, Jane? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. It's nighttime here, so we're in a different time zone from those who might be tuning in from different countries. I am based in Manila, as it was mentioned, and this project is an initiative that draws from experiences from other countries, but it's a first in Asia, as far as we've known, and our reach in UNODC at different offices. So this is particularly lessons from the Philippines, but it draws on a larger a larger level of cooperation and inspiration in different countries. Just to have an idea of what I aim to present, I would like to give a very brief introduction of UNODC for those who might not be familiar with the organization, then talk about international standards on reading in prisons, then a little bit of context in the incarceration context in the Philippines, and then we'll talk about the initiative itself in a timeline manner and some of the key highlights, and then highlight that this, even though it is an interesting, positive practice, there's a long way to go in actually providing reading as a universal right for all people incarcerated in the Philippines, and making the goals that this policy has a reality. Well, first, UNODC is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. It's a United Nations body created about 30 years ago, and it focuses on the whole criminal justice approach, and that includes, at some point, incarceration or prisons. If people are held accountable and are brought to justice and have prison time as a source of punishment, this is where we come in. But the broader UNODC has this goal of making the world safer from drugs, from organized crime, corruption, and terrorism. But the means to do that is also through a commitment to health, security, and justice. These are very broad words, but we always like to give it a little bit of a basis and concrete meaning. In this case, the connection between health and justice, so the connection with the justice section, the justice sector, is very tangible, and we'll discuss it later on. So this is really an effort for us to try to ensure that the prison system, in its efforts to reduce recidivism and facilitate reintegration back into society of those who have been arrested, are connected with these other principles. So hopefully we're trying to do that in the best way possible. Our mandates are based on 5 pillars. So for those who might not know, we have a strong pillar of working against, or to prevent, better said, terrorism and violent extremism. We work a lot on drug policy, but firmly based on a health-based approach. You'll see the relevance for this in the Philippines, because 80% of people incarcerated are for drug-related offenses. We also work on countering corruption, which is an important issue overall, but also within the prison system. And this is also a connection to this project, with transnational organized crime in its different forms, and the area that I work on specifically, which is crime prevention and criminal justice. But in the Philippines, there's a very strict connection between the drug policy and the criminal justice system that we will see moving forward. Our main guide, so talking a bit about international standards, are based on the UN minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners, otherwise known as the Nelson Mandela rules. And these rules are really the basis for our work. UNODC is what we call the custodian of these rules. So we really are in the UN system, the body that kind of wants to see this implemented in practice. We support member states with technical assistance, equipment, and different forms of support to make sure that these rules are a reality in practice. So I want to share with you 4 rules that talk about reading, that has reading as its main concern, or one of its main concerns. The first one, we need to start with Rule 64. So it's a bit 4 slides, but bear with me, it's relevant for how we based this policy. Rule 64 says every prison, it's very, shall have, so it's strong wording, a library. This library should be used for all categories of prisoners, and it shall be adequately stocked with both recreational and instructional books, and prisoners shall be encouraged to make full use of it. So I've highlighted 3 sections, and these are the 3 sections that we really take into account, and they're the basis of the policy that was developed by the Jail Bureau, or the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology. It's a long name, otherwise known as BJMP. So you'll hear me say this acronym, BJMP, a few times. The first is a non-discriminatory clause, right? So all categories of prisoners. So this is very important in a country where very few prisoners had access to books and have access to education in a traditional classroom setting. When we started this project, it was about 13% of all people incarcerated in jails had access to time allowances through education. It's a very low number. Now that number has increased up to 19%. It's a small increase, but a significant one in the context. So the idea of expanding to all, to universalize, is a key thing, and it's a key thing in the policy that's currently in force. We've also highlighted in the process of curating the collection of books, this idea that it shouldn't just be math books or masonry books or electronic teaching, vocational training books, which is a lot of the mindset for many lay persons in this, and even for jail officers, is this idea that it should always be vocationally oriented. So it was a strong part of the discussions and the consultation process to also have a recreational aspect to the collection, to make it interesting. People want to go there. They want to read what they are interested in beyond the more, let's say, utilitarian, and which is, of course, very important and related to vocational training and instruction, no? And the third is perhaps the most important part, which is the encouragement. So in the Philippines, there is a system of time allowances. Basically, the more you read, the earlier you can be released. This is the basic logic for this initiative. And we've grounded this initiative on this part. So the last part of Rule 64, which is the encouragement. You are strongly encouraged if you understand that by engaging in reading and in libraries activities, it's a strong incentive for people because they can have an earlier release. No, so these are 3 main points, and they are really at the cornerstone of the policy. Next, we have Rule 14. So this is an interesting thing that we've been discussing a lot, which is related to prison design and architecture. So in Rule 14, it says all prisoners, in all places where prisoners are required to live or work, they should have windows large enough to allow natural light that allows them to read and work, and should allow fresh air and adequate ventilation. It also says that artificial light should be provided so that people can read properly or work without injury to eyesight. So that also has an implication in terms of the physical environment, and this is something that we've also been observing in our visits of evaluation. We'll talk about that later, which Jane has been supporting us with, which is also a strong component, understanding where libraries are, where do people read, and to see if the physical environment follows these guidelines from the Nelson Mandela rules. The next rule I want to mention, the second to last, is on Rule 117. And this is very interesting because it mentions that, especially for pretrial prisoners, people who haven't been sentenced yet, but are detained, they should be allowed, they shall be allowed, it's very strong wording again, to procure at their own expense of a third party books, newspapers, writing materials, or other means of occupation compatible with the administration of justice. So also allowed, this is kind of we interpret this as not as a restrictive, it should be the least restrictive collection as possible, right? So not understanding all these pre-requirements of in a way, establishing very strict guidelines for books to be allowed into facilities. So the assumption, this is also in the policy, the assumption is that books should be allowed, and the exception should be if there's a sensitive issue, or if it deals with a very complicated context for security or for other matters, then that should be not allowed, but as an exception, as opposed to a prerequisite in coming up with the collection and for allowing books to get in. Next, we mentioned religion. So there's also, it's a strong component of the discussions in the Philippines, which is a Christian majority country, but it also has a sizable Muslim population. And this is a very important rule that's, that establishes that prisoners shall be allowed to have in their possession books of religious observance and instruction with their own, what they're interested in. So this is something very important, and especially in the regions in the Philippines where there is a sizable Muslim population. This has been a part of the collection of having equally some literature from Christian from Christian followers, but also Islamic literature that is available in those places. This is perhaps on top of all that, our main guideline for working is the International Federation of Libraries, Associations, and Institutions, a very long name. We'll call it IFLA, the guidelines on library services to prisoners. So even the language here was very important to us. It guided the way we think about it, as opposed to not prison library, right? But the idea of library services that are connected to prisoners. So this is very strong in the policy, and what we've done, which is as much as possible, provide library services that are available in the community. So the public library in the city should be connected to the jail library. Connections that are outside should be made available as much as possible. Funding processes. If the city, has a budget for procuring books on a yearly basis, they should also contemplate the jail libraries in this process. And all this is in the policy. And this is based on these guidelines. So this is very recent, and I'll show you in a bit. But basically, it was launched in March 23, and in the same month, I think the next week, we had a launch, which I think was the first physical, in-person launch. I'm not sure, in the world maybe, but certainly in Asia, and it was here in Manila. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, with several countries attending. And it has been a key source, a key reference, for the development of the policy here. We also been guided for different handbooks that UNODC has. If you're interested in prison reform, prison issues, the UNODC has over 24 handbooks on very specific issues. But some of the handbooks that call our attention are based on reducing overcrowding, alternatives to imprisonment, which all kind of mention countries' experiences and highlight experiences that connect activities that are important for reintegration, in connecting that to alternatives to incarceration, to early releases, into other modes of reducing, prison occupancy, or in the Philippines case, also prison overcrowding. So a bit of context in the Philippines, so you'd know from where we're talking, situated for the international, for people who are not from the Philippines, who might be tuning in. The Philippines is currently ranked as the 11th in the global ranking of the largest prison population, jail population. Prison and jails have different meanings in the Philippines, but let's use it interchangeably for this webinar. It has over approximately 170 to 180,000 people incarcerated. That's a very sizable, it's a big number. Even though the incarceration rate is about 126, 128 people per 100,000. So compared to other countries, the rate of incarceration is not very high. However, the total numbers are. But the most striking statistic is the next, right? It's considered either the third or the fourth most overcrowded prison system in the planet. So that has an average of 360% overcrowding. So that means a place designed for 10 people would have 36 on average. Some places in the country, here in Metro Manila, there are facilities which are 1,000% overcrowded. So it's a place designed for 10 that has 100. So it's very, very striking, and that causes several problems, no? In the last years, no, from 2015 to 2021, give a parameter, population grew massively, 75%, and the facilities were not able to keep up with that growth. And in the country, 70% of prisoners are under pretrial detention, so they haven't been sentenced yet. And 80% of those are there for drug-related offenses. In the case of women, that's even a higher number. It's like 90%. So it's very hard to disentangle the drug policy from the prison system. No, they're extremely connected. All these issues of overcrowding also have caused many health problems. They cause problems that are vast, but particularly it has an impact on prison deaths, which in the Philippines, they are really high compared to other countries in Southeast Asia, and it's 2.5 times higher than the average Filipino. Okay, this is a timeline, so I try to go back in memory and go through the files to have a, if this is good for reference for people in other countries and other jurisdictions who might, be interested to implement a similar initiative. This is how we engage in it. In early 2022, we had initial discussions with the BJMP, the Jail Bureau, on how to expand reading in libraries and jails. They were very interested in engaging with that. And our first move was, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We got to talk to people who know about this. We got to talk to the librarians. So this is when we went and met the National Library of the Philippines. And they immediately were extremely excited about the project. They never thought of books literally freeing people or connecting reading with liberty in such a clear manner with this project. So they have, from day one, been a key pillar in the development of this initiative. They were even part of the discussion of the name, right? Read your way out in this idea. Later that year, in the following month, we created a technical working group, a TWG, as it's often, the acronym in the Philippines, with the Jail Bureau to develop a policy to discuss what to do. And then in the next month, based on the work of this working group, we held 4 consultations in September with over 120 jail officers being heard in different parts of the country, both online and in 2 in-person events. So there was a lot of input. And then the Philippine Development Plan, from 5 years, also included provisions on reducing overcrowding and having a stronger push for reintegration related services, which we also thought was a good opportunity to hook this initiative to. And then in March 2023, we held the launch event of this initiative and also the launch of the international guidelines from IFLA for library services in prisons in Asia. So this was a very important event. People still remember it. They remember, what they learned. There was a lot of international experts. So it was really a milestone in this process. And then later in September, after a lot of drafting and consultation, the Jail Bureau approved the reading policy, which is extremely important and based on our knowledge from other jurisdictions. It's one of the newest policies, but also one of the most progressive and one of the most customized to a developing country with many challenges, wherein, for example, most prisoners don't know how to read, right? All right, so then there are several provisions that I will talk later on how this policy was adjusted to this audience, Then moving a little bit further in December, we held a National Decongestion Summit. This was a big summit that aimed to discuss ideas on how to reduce overcrowding, and the Read Your Way Out was something that was really a point of highlight in this summit. And that has led later on, a few months later, to the Supreme Court, and this we know by contacts, by communication and dialogue with the Supreme Court, that the summit was a strong incentive for tabling a case that allowed the Supreme Court to expand the time allowances for people charged with what is understood as heinous crimes. So these are crimes that are punishable with life imprisonment. And it seems in many jurisdictions, these are very serious, very few crimes. In the Philippines, it can apply, for example, if you have a certain quantity of drugs, that will be considered, if it's above a certain limit, that can be considered a heinous crime. So that applies to thousands of people. For you to have an idea, right now, out of 120,000 prisoners in pretrial detention, approximately 46,000 are there charged with heinous crimes. So this is extremely important in expanding this benefit to that public, and allow potentially for them getting engaged in reading, earning time allowances, and having earlier releases. And I'd like to finalize with something very recent from January this year, which we've undertook an evaluation of 13 out of 7 pilot jails that we've established libraries in, and some initial kind of thoughts on how that's going and some ideas. A bit on the consultation and engagement process. As I mentioned, the National Library of the Philippines was a key partner from day one, and they've supported us technically on how to set up a collection, like what is the basic collection for a public library in the community. So that was our basis as well. Like, don't need to reinvent the wheel. What are the types of books if you want to establish a library in a new public library in a city or in a specific neighborhood? So that we based on that to kind of have an idea of the collections, of what kind of books would we be, we would be getting for the jails. And then we said, okay, that's great, but a jail is not a neighborhood, right? The neighborhood has many different people that access the library. You have children, you have different ages. In prison, there's a specific audience. So we felt it was crucial to have consultation processes with wardens, and we also had a survey that was circulated with the prisoners to have an idea of what they were interested in reading. There were 4 consultation meetings, and more than 120 officers were heard. The survey had a smaller number. It was hard to implement with the timeline we had, but we still got some interesting input from the prisoners themselves. In this process, we learned, for example, that it was very important to have an important part of the collection on legal books, right? Since most of the people incarcerated are pre-trial, right? So they haven't been tried. So they want to understand their case. They want to learn more about the law. So that was a key aspect that was highlighted in that kind of in those consultations. Another point was language, right? The Philippines does adopt English as an official language, but most of the population speak Tagalog as it's taught in the schools, right? So this is or Filipino, but they also have local languages in different regions of the country. So the language aspect was also very important, that to not have so many books in English, because they're harder to read, right? So that was very important in trying to find literature that was in the local languages, but mostly in Tagalog, to be part of that, amongst many other aspects of the consultation process. Okay, I'm fine. I did all that to get to the initiative itself. No, the initiative, it's called the Read Your Way Out initiative. It's based on this premise that prisoners can earn time allowances. So basically, this is called remission in other countries. Depends, different countries call it different things. Some countries do not have this, but it's a very important incentive mechanism for prisoners to engage in constructive activities that facilitate their reintegration. So that can be work. The more a certain time of work gets you a little reduction, a certain amount of time spent studying also can do that. And, so it's productive, positive activities earn time allowances. Also in the Philippines and in several countries, it's often related also to good behavior. So if you behave well for doing a certain amount of time, you also are able to get, reduction of your detention time. So this was also thinking about the idea of overcrowding, since this is the most important problem in the country, because it has so many humanitarian effects on health, on the functioning of the justice system, on many issues, that we wanted to connect that in the rationale of the project. But it also had a benefit in itself, right? It would potentially incentivize more prisoners to engage in reading, for those who don't know how to read, to want to learn how to read, all of that, thinking about the positive effects that it could have with an earlier release. So the idea of, I want to read my way out is very appealing, no? However, we do face a problem. As I mentioned, many prisoners, this is also came from the consultations, which is, many prisoners in some regions don't know how to read. They would not get a book because not because they're not interested necessarily, but they're not able to read. And sometimes the books they don't include pictures, so there are no graphic novels or other things that were identified. It's another example of something that came out of the consultation sessions. So we supported the Bureau of Jails to develop this idea of a reading buddy, which is this idea of prisoners who have a higher level of reading skill are able to read to others or to help them out in reading. And all of that is considered a reading activity, right? So that is the unit of analysis, or the basic unit of the policy, is a reading activity. So this is not based on essays. Many countries, when they do this, you read a book, you write an essay, and the essay is the basis for assessing that you read and then for computing reduction in detention time. This is not what is adopted in the Philippines. It's in a perspective of time engaged in reading activities. So this can involve book clubs or book discussions, or reading out loud and discussion following that. All of that is computed, the time that you spend doing that, and that is all eligible to become time allowances. We've also included in this process, supported the Bureau of many ideas that came out of this process, in having audiobooks to allow people who are not able to read, but to listen to books and then have activities discussing, etc. And that time could be also accounted as time allowances. And there are also this issue of the facilities not being so overcrowded and not having enough spaces for proper libraries, or maybe there is a space for libraries, but it's hard for people to access because of movement within the facility. So this idea of book trolleys to allow books to move around in the facility and have access to books maybe in days that you're not able to access, or maybe there's a security consideration that people cannot physically go because facilities are small and overcrowded and there's a security component. This is a very important adjustment. I also wanted to highlight that this has a legal basis. If you're more interested in this, happy to share the legislation. In the Philippines, time allowances have been part of the legal system since 1930. So this is based, still they were under the US system at the time. So the revised penal code that is from 1930 and already adopts the time allowances as an institute, as this idea that is implementable. And then in 2012, the penal code went through a review process, and they went into more detail about how to compute and specific eligibility criteria that is also in our Republic Act 10,592. We focus on a special category, special category of time allowances for study, teaching, and mentoring. So that's called PAS-TM, time allowances for study, teaching, and mentoring. So we've considered in the beginning, the biggest resistance, especially from the legal practitioners, was that the law doesn't say reading, right? The law says study, teaching, and mentoring. So that was the first challenge, was on interpreting the law and considering this initiative as being embedded in study, teaching, and mentoring. So everything that you think for the reading buddies, right? They're either mentoring or teaching the other, their fellow prisoners to read or to reading together. So this was a very important innovation on the interpretation of reading. So that was our first challenge, is to interpret the law and to understand that reading is part, an integral part of these actions, of these three actions. And that was the basis that allowed us to move forward with this idea. This is just a graphic representation of our rationale. The biggest chunk of work goes into computing time allowances. That is very, very important. And it takes a lot of, you have to engage in a lot of activities to allow for that to be computed. And that in it can then facilitate an earlier release, and more releases would allow what we call jail decongestion, right? A reduction of overcrowding. This is just a picture from the national launch that was held in March 2023. Both Lisa and Jane were kind enough to join us and share their experience along experts from many countries. And then we had 6 representatives from the prison service and the National Library of 6 countries in Southeast Asia that flew to Manila and attended the 3 days of conference with us. And this has been also a very important effect of this project. We know that there are now initiatives in different degrees of maturity in Malaysia, in Thailand, and in Cambodia in trying to implement a similar idea in their own countries with different legislation. So the Philippines, we had a very big advantage because the law already had that provision on time allowances, and it had study and teaching and mentoring. Other countries don't have that, so they have to, they're considering different ways to implement this principle, perhaps through different arrangements in the penal regimes, when people move forward and get, not so restrictive housing, etc. So there are different ways that this can be adopted in facilitating and easing, let's say, life in incarceration, which is tends to be very harsh. This allowed the consolidation of the initiative, and there were over 200 people participating. And this is just we showcased one of the jails with the reading policy when it's already it's already been passed. We're happy to share that's available publicly on the BJMP's website. And it's a long document with a lot of references, and you can see IFLA's guidelines here and there, some Nelson Mandela if you read it properly. And it, in our view, perhaps one of the most progressive policy documents in among prison administrations around the world, with this idea of the reading activity as the basic unit for granting time allowances, as I mentioned before, and entering into a lot of detail in terms of how the jails can work, and the physical space and the jail trolleys and the reading buddies, and all these aspects are covered there. I also wanted to highlight, this is very important, the recent Supreme Court ruling. The case is called Ginto et al. V Department of Justice, but it's a case involving a convicted prisoner who argued that his restriction of GCTA, not being able to have the time allowances, was not according to the law, and the Supreme Court agreed with that argument, and has made it available to people convicted of heinous crimes, which has an immense potential to allow decongestion of the facilities, and people, especially who have been for 10, 20 years, often for nonviolent offenses, to be able to have an earlier release and prospects of reintegration in the world outside. It also may allow for more non-custodial measures, which is something we prioritize, not using incarceration as the only response. It should be the exception, not the rule, in facilitating a transition from from over-reliance on incarceration to using more non-custodial measures, is something that we're very keen on supporting around the world, and in the Philippines in particular. And then my last slide is on evaluation. We've started this year in January, as I mentioned. We did support the establishment through this project It was at the time with support from the US government with a big project in the region that allowed this, and also from the Australian government. And we were able to procure books and shelves and computers and chairs for establishing new jails in 13 facilities, right? And this has been over a year now. The policies from September 2023, these jails were implemented in the following months, but it's been roughly a year since all of them have been functioning. And then earlier this year, we went to 7 of them. And Dr. Jane Gardner here is supporting us in this evaluation process. And we've already have some insights into the local implementation, no? So that includes even things like library cards being issued per prisoner and having them connected to the public library system and being able to access books outside. The reading buddy system has been adjusted to different localities. When there's a language issue, they're trying to kind of pair people from the same language and often from the religion, if there's an interest on religious text. And that kind of those systems that haven't been really detailed in the policy are working in an interesting way at the local level. However, there's also demand for change, for more diversity in the collections, different books, and also different ways in a very overcrowded in a facility that was not planned to have a library, how they've adjusted that in the design, also in their architecture. Where is the library located in the facility? How are they doing it? In some places, it's, that lacks ventilation. In other places, it's more, adjusted to the local weather. There are fans, and it's a more conducive place for people to read in. And there's variation that we're observing, and hopefully we can work to support and make it, more in line with international standards. Actually, this is my last slide, not the previous. There's a long way to go for sure. This is a pilot. It was a pilot that we supported in 13 jails. However, I would say that these things will take time, no? So we have a documented case in the south, in Zamboanga, where we had 5 prisoners released because of time allowances computed to reading. So they literally read their way out. But it's 5 people. It's small price, because it takes time for the computation and all this machinery to work, and then it actually lead to releases. But we're seeing little by little. This was in December last year, and they were able to be home with their families for Christmas, right? So that's something it's a very concrete story, but still a limited number. So we're aware of that. We're also aware that it's 13 jails out of 470 plus, right? So it's a massive system, and many of them do have libraries in different degrees. We've supported 13 more, but apparently our latest data shows that about 30% of the jails in the country have some sort of library in different stages, but we still need to expand and universalize, as it is shown in the Nelson Mandela rules. Every prison shall have a library, There's also challenges with GCTA calculations. Some facilities, have a hard time. There's not a digital system established nationally on this. It's often done by hand, and sometimes people compute it differently. So there's also this type of human error in the calculation that also may delay releases and might, hinder the effects that this policy can have. And all that, there's a persistent challenge that makes everything more difficult, which is the overcrowding, the lack of personnel. Even though they do an amazing job of trying to overcome those challenges, overcrowding and congestion is certainly something very big. And we're trying to tackle it in UNODC in our office, not only by this project, but by different initiatives related to legislative reform, connections with the justice, with the Supreme Court and the judiciary, legal aid, and different avenues. But it's a very hard problem in many countries, but we're engaged and committed to try to contribute to that solution. Yes, and I'll end here. Thank you very much. And I'm open. I'm happy to, you know, engage in a conversation for questions or anything.
Thank you,
Thank you again,
Raphael.
Lisa and
That's
Jane.
fantastic. Really lovely to see all those details. So we've got quite a few questions here. I'm not sure if we'll get through all of them, but we'll give it a go. First one is from Timothy Island. Hello, Timothy. Welcome. Timothy is saying, are there any collective activities in which prisoners can sit together to discuss what they're reading with a teacher moderating the activity?
Yes, so this has different arrangements. This is the reading policy is one aspect, but there's an education policy that's connected to it. In the education policy, they do have regular teachers from outside that come, and that they call it an alternative learning system. That's how we call it here. And there's a lot of opportunities for engaging with teachers. And in some jails, we're trying to see how that connection is made, right? I think it's still very incipient, still a very limited process, but hopefully we would like to see the teachers who come to teach on a more, let's say, formal curriculum to use the resources available in the library to discuss, right? And to be able to have a bigger discussion. We do have an advantage that several jail officers had done library studies in college, and then they went into the jail service, right? So they were not hired as librarians. They were hired as regular, you know, officers, but then they have the library background. So there's about 26 of them spread out throughout the country, and they are very big advocates of this. And there's a lot of discussion with them. So they do act as kind of a support for, as a librarian would in a regular library, and have discussions. But this is also what we're trying to do in the evaluation process throughout this year, to see what are the gaps, how is it really working in practice, and hopefully improve.
Great. Okay, now I've got a question here. I'm actually going to combine two questions because they're both about the collections that you have there. So Timothy again is interested in if you have comics in the collections, and Laura, hello Laura, was interested in knowing whether you have some sort of like low literacy type books in there for people who are just developing their reading skills.
Yes. First for the comics, yeah, this was identified early on in the consultation. So there's a whole section of the collection that's on comic books and graphic novels, and in Tagalog, right? So in the most widely spoken language in the country, not in English preferably. So that's available. We've also the second one was on
On sort of like, you know, we have
reading
books that
skills,
are
yeah?
designed for adults, but they're very basic, assuming low literacy levels.
Yeah, in the Philippines, there is this modality of books. They call it wikahon. So it's kind of they also use it for facilitating literacy classes in the community. So it's used outside. And in every library that we've supported in this initiative, there's also a wikahon section. So it's a simple kind of language. There's a lot of graphics in it, and it's based on the Department of Education's guidelines on literacy. So yeah, that was also part of the aspect. You know, one thing that we also had some board games, chess, and some board games part of the collection. I don't know if I can say that. The librarians may correct me if I'm wrong. But one thing that was highlighted in a recent visit, for example, was an interest in dictionaries, because they play, what's the name of that game that you have to make the words?
Scrabble.
Scrabble, exactly.
Yes.
Super thing for literacy, like to train it. And unfortunately, we didn't add a dictionary. So that, you know, we didn't think about that at the time. But it goes to show how these things are this evaluation will be very fruitful in thinking of how to complement that. One would think dictionaries to learn how to read, at least for me, that was not an immediate connection. But when you put Scrabble into the equation, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, indeed. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee who's interested in how you actually know that the PDLs are actually reading. How are you keeping track that they're not just flicking through the pages and pretending?
That is a great question that we are always asked. In each jail in the Philippines, there is departments, so at the jail level, it's called the Welfare and Development Officer. So welfare, and that's a very beautiful way to put it. You know, in some jurisdictions, they call it reformation officer. Basically, the person who handles work, education, family visits, so a bit of part education, part social work kind of officer. So in every facility in the country, there is such an officer with that duty. It's assigned so. And most often than not, they try to associate that with the person's background. So it's very common to have people who have done some, who have experience in teaching, or who are social workers, or who have that background in studies. So that the main driver for this policy at the jail level is through this officer or officers. If it's a bigger facility, there will be a number of these. So these officers are in charge to kind of checking and kind of monitoring how that is taking place, right? That is purposefully not specified in detail in the policy, as it was understood that it will be a lot of initiatives in how to make that happen. So what we're seeing is in different jails, different arrangements of how to assess that they read, no? In some cases, they are using book clubs, so book discussions. After there's a book that's been read, the officer engages and has a discussion. In other instances, they would witness a collective reading of a book, if it's a reading buddy. So that can also be computed, the time that's spent. And if there's engagement, of course. But in a nutshell, for a short answer, there is an officer who is primarily responsible for activities related to education, reintegration, family connection. That's the Welfare and Development Officer. That has a leading role in assessing, right? But this is also part of an ongoing evaluation and monitoring to see how are they doing that, right? So we hope to have more data to share soon.
Lovely, thank you. Speaking of guards, I'm going to jump down to Beatrice's question. Hello, Beatrice, welcome. Beatrice is interested in what the proportion of guards and prisoners are who are in charge of the library management in those 13 pilot libraries.
Hello, Beatrice. I recognize the name. Good to see you here. The proportion of guards, that varies according to jail, right? So in some facilities that are in smaller cities, further away from large urban centers, the proportion tends to be a little bit bigger. But overwhelmingly, as I mentioned, there is one officer in every jail that has this role. If it's a very small jail with like 50 prisoners, that officer might multitask. They might have that role and then other roles. But, you know, as a rule of thumb, it's an officer that, you know, has a background, that they're interested in this area. So we're hopeful that this arrangement, the system, is positive. But the country suffers from chronic overcrowding. So the proportion is far from appropriate, especially if you're aiming at universalizing reading, right? All the prisoners in a facility reading, and allowing that system to take place and monitoring, it will be a big challenge. So as at this stage, from what we're initially seeing from the data, it is still a minority of prisoners who have access to the library, who are actually using it. But I also understand that there is a connection between that limitation and the capacity of, you know, the prison officers to manage, to actually assess. So these are challenges that we want to monitor more closely and see how we can perhaps have support from external partners. So this is something very important also in the policy, is saying this is not a jail problem. This is a community problem, right? And the jail is part of the community. So making that connection. So how can we get university students from library studies to have extension, you know, projects and support in reading activities, and that can be properly assessed and then computed? How can we get even the public library from the city itself to do activities and engage? Anyways, also invite the religious groups and civil society organizations that do have contacts with the jail system, that they do visit regularly. And the idea is that they could also be part of this initiative and kind of support jail officers in this endeavor. And here they call them service providers, these external people who come in to support, no? So that's also something we would bet on as an alternative to compensate for the overcrowding and not enough officers handling this.
Great. I'm going to combine two more questions. Karen, hello, Karen, is interested in how you, whether there is a budget for the library collections, and Laura's also asked about the role of public libraries in supporting the jail libraries. And I think those two questions will be answered in the same way.
Very good question on the budget. As you know, like prison services around the world, they tend not to be a budget priority for for the political leadership of most countries, right? And we've tried to acknowledge that, but also understanding, based on the Nelson Mandela rules, it shouldn't be just a prison responsibility, right? It should be prison services should be connected as much as possible to the regular public services available outside, right? So within that mindset, that it's also kind of hinted in the policy that to connect with the local government and have the budget for the public library at the local government to include jail libraries, which are categorized in the Philippines as special libraries because they're dedicated to a special audience, not public libraries of a broader nature, and have a specific budget on that. There's currently in the country, there is the library law, the National Library of the Philippines legislation. So kind of the legislation that kind of guides library services in the country is under review. And they have included in the proposal from the government to include jail libraries and prison libraries as part of this public library domain that would allow for it to be a standard operation to include it as part of the budget. That's still under discussion. Legislative processes take time. We're supportive of that, but that will take a while. In the meantime, it's supportive on a case-by-case basis at the local level, right? In a few cities, for example, in Marawi, it's a city in the south, there's also commitment from the local government to do that, right? To kind of include it in the budget. But as we say in Tagalog, unti-unti, which means little by little.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more very quick question, and that will go to Karen. Karen was interested in whether the PDLs are allowed to own their own books. Do they allowed to have families bring in books perhaps, or is it really just access to the library collections?
I think, when you go to jails and prisons in the Philippines, you see books brought in by family. It is a common thing. And there's not a specific restriction, there's not, in that sense, the policy, it doesn't put an a priori, restriction on books, and then you have to have a committee to review, and then, which was an idea in the beginning, which we didn't want to reinforce, but rather, unless it's something very blatant, we give an example at the time, a manual to build a bomb. Maybe that's, maybe that's not the most appropriate, reading material. But, except from these very extreme examples, such as this, of course, it's an anecdotal example, but it is allowed. So we don't have an assessment so much about that. Unfortunately, most prisoners in the Philippines, they come from very poor backgrounds. Family members also have very little formal schooling. So even the idea of bringing books is not really a common practice. So I wouldn't say that is, if we had to list the issues or the problems, that's not something that's ever highlighted, either by prisoners or officers when I'm thinking about the evaluation. Perhaps it's a good question to be asked. Thank you for that.
Yes, thank you for all the questions. If there are outstanding questions, we will somehow try to answer them. Personally, I'm very excited to hear that you are in touch with other countries. And I remember at the launch, there were different countries, you mentioned that. So this is, of course, our idea, to share experiences, to hope that other countries go similar ways. You certainly learned from Brazil and their remission for reading programs. So there were experiences before. I can really highlight again our online collection of prison education case studies, and your case is one of them. Actually, we should highlight it was the first one, because when Jane and I were in March 2 years ago at the launch, you said already, please, how can we document our experiences? We want to share, we want others to learn from it. And Jane and I thought how to do it, where to put it. And in the end, we thought, why not having a whole collection on prison education studies? Which brings me to a last question I received from a colleague from Lenny Martini from UNIVOC, our UN colleagues. She asked about TVET in prisons and just to the technical vocational training in prisons. And I can share that in the online collection, we have several cases, and I will also share them with you individually. You find the online link in the chat. You also find in the chat a link to our email listserv. In the end, it's a small community. In the end, I'm always surprised how similar some issues are. I've been to different countries. Prisons are super different in different countries. The overcrowding was really impressive in the Philippines. Jane and I were fortunate. We went to a prison there, thanks to you, Raphael, and the team. But the prison library issues are very much the same. Low literacy, a lot of poor people. So let's share how we can best help each other. Let me say then, talk about the next webinar. It will be on 21st of May. We will talk then with Miguel Rivera Donoso. We will talk about prison libraries and reading efforts in Chile, go to a different part of the world. Yes, and with this, I would like to wish you all a wonderful day. Say a very special thank to you, Raphael, that you shared your experiences. To Jane, we know it's late in the evening towards night in your parts. Yes, I hope to see you all again in May. And until then, I say bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you very much. Maraming salamat.